Hi guys, so many of you wanted to have a color grading tutorial for F-LOG from the Fujifilm X-T4, but also other Fujifilm cameras. So here it is, and we will cover two ways to color grade F-LOG. The first one using different kinds of LUTs, and the second one completely custom. So let's get started. So I got a few clips here from a recent Fujifilm X-T4 cinematic video that I published. It's really cool, so check it out. I will link that here in the upper left corner. And I would say let's get started with the first LUTs that I oftentimes recommend, which is the official Fujifilm F-LOG conversion LUTs. So they are really cool. You will find them on the Fujifilm website in the download section below X-T4, X-T3 or whatever camera you have, but only if your camera supports F-LOG, of course. And when you load this LUT in there, like here, you will see that I loaded the LUT F-LOG to Eterna, and there you see you directly get a pretty usable image. So you see before, that's the F-LOG version, and here after grading it with this LUT. So that's a great starting point. I would not directly use it like that because there's definitely still something that you can do to create a creative look, to make it look better, but this is a really good starting point. So about creating a final look, we'll come to that a bit later. But then there are also different LUTs from Fujifilm. So for example, what you find here is F-LOG to bleach bypass. You see that here, Eterna BB. But I would not use that for that clip here. It doesn't really come out good. But for other clips, and if you like the bleach bypass look, then that also works. Then there is also the F-LOG to BT709 LUT, which is supposed to convert it to normal 709 colors, but it doesn't work. I don't know why. This LUT pack just doesn't do anything to my footage. I downloaded it several times and tested it already, but it doesn't do anything. So there is an error somewhere on the Fuji side, I think. Maybe they can correct it in the future. And you will also find a wide dynamic range, like a WDR. And there you see it like makes everything a bit darker and so on. So I would not really use that. From these LUTs, my recommendation is definitely to use the Eterna, the normal Eterna LUT, because that gives you a good starting point. So this conversion to Eterna gives you a good starting point, but there are also other LUTs that you can use, and that's, for example, to go directly into a film simulation from Fujifilm. And for example, in the official LUTs, as I showed you before, you can do that by going to Eterna bleach bypass. But what I usually do is classic chrome, because classic chrome is really my favorite color profile of film simulation on the Fujifilm X-T4. So I shoot most of my clips in classic chrome and some other clips in F-LOG when I want to have a bit more dynamic range, but then it's a problem to match these colors in post. And what helps me here is a LUT pack that I found from Colorizer. I will also leave a link to that in the description below. And there you will find F-LOG conversion LUTs for all these film simulations. As you can see here, there's classic chrome, different LUTs actually. The DR100 normal is a bit too contrasty, so that ruins my shadows here completely. But if I use the DR100 LC, which stands for low contrast, then it directly looks pretty good. The shadows are still a little bit crushed, so what I did here, I add some color wheels. So as you can see here, I lifted the midtones quite a bit, brought the shadows a bit down again to compensate for that, and that gives me all these details back here in the shadows after applying this LUT. And then I also added color curves, so an S curve to give it more contrast, because as you can tell, without the curves, it's a bit less contrast, it looks a bit too flat. So by applying this S curve, definitely looks a bit better. And in this LUT pack you will find so many other LUTs, like for S tier, Eterna, Pro Negative, Pro Via, Velvia. So it's a great LUT pack that I can absolutely recommend, and that helped me a lot to go from F-LOG to classic chrome when I had to match these clips. So these first two kinds of LUTs stick to the native Fujifilm colors, and that's obviously great. But there's also a third way, and that is by using a LUT that directly converts F-LOG to a creative look. And you can do that, for example, with a LUT pack that I published last week, which is called Fujifilm Outdoor LUTs. There you will find some looks that I love for this camera that work perfect for outdoor footage, especially if you're up in the mountains and so on. I will leave a link to that in the description below if you like these looks as well. And here I want to show you one LUT that works really good for that clip, and that's Outdoor 8 F-LOG. So as you can see here, it directly brings in a lot of contrast and kind of a final look. Like you have a lot of information or contrast in the mountains here, but this specific LUT for this clip, I would also say it makes the corn plants here a little bit too dark. That just happens because it's such a high dynamic range situation. It's pretty exceptional. So here you can also easily compensate for that by adding some color wheels and lifting the midtones a little bit. So that's actually a great look that you can achieve pretty quickly with this LUT. But what you probably also noticed is that I have a plugin called Color Finale Pro here in the top, and this is the next point that I want to come to here in this video, and this is that a LUT is only a starting point. It's never really the final result that you want to have for your clip, even if it's a creative look LUT like with my LUT pack. So what I did with this plugin here, and by the way, you don't need Color Finale Pro to do that. You can do all of that stuff with the native Final Cut tools, but Color Finale Pro has a bit better workflow. I just prefer that LUT pack. So what you see here when I turn that on, there's the final look that I achieved in the video that I mentioned at the beginning. So what I did here is, and I open this layers and I turn all of the other grades off. I also started by inserting the Outdoor 8 LUT from my own LUT pack, and then to bring out a bit more detail here in the corn field is I lowered the contrast a little bit, and I also increased the temperature, the white balance a little bit, because I found it a bit too bluish. So after that, I used curves to introduce a bit more red in the highlights here. As you can see before, it looks really flat. It's just normal white clouds with this nice sun there, but it doesn't do anything because there's no color in there. So for this shot, I really wanted to have more color in there. There's no way to really do that with a LUT, because that's really clip specific. There are LUTs that push colors in the highlights and so on, yes, but because it's so specific to this clip, there's no really a way to achieve that look with a LUT. And that's why I just used curves here. As you can see, I pushed a bit of red in the highlights and adjusted the greens and the blues there as well. And then I used the vector tool because, as you can see, it looks a bit too reddish. Like, I didn't like this look. So I used the vector tool here to adjust the hue of the reds a bit more in the yellow direction. You can achieve the same with the hue versus saturation curves in Final Cut Pro, so you don't really need Color Finale for that. It's just, this is actually what I like about Color Finale. You have this vector tool here, and that goes a bit quicker than having to adjust these curves there all the time. Then what I also did here, like, you see that the highlights look really bright, and that's why you can't see so much detail anymore in the clouds. So I brought the highlights a bit down so that more details reveal here in the clouds, but also in the background of the mountains, so that overall it looks a bit nicer. So that's basically what I did here for this shot to achieve my final look. It just looks a lot better, and that does not only count for F-Log. That's generally the same even if you shoot in a film simulation. For example, in the next shot here, it's one of my favorite. They are shot in Eternal Bleach Bypass, but I decreased the contrast a bit in the camera by setting this curve there to -2, flattening the curve basically. And you see it looks kind of flat. It's definitely not bad, but it's a pretty flat shot. So here I also created my final look by adding a lot more contrast, and then I used the vector tool to increase the saturation of the reds, and I decreased the saturation of the blues, and also did some adjustments here with the color wheels, like I made the midtones a bit darker. So there's my final look, and as you can see, even if I use the film simulation in the camera, like straight out of camera, it doesn't pop as much as with my final color grade. So that's why I recommend, doesn't matter if you shoot F-Log and you use a LUT to convert it, or if you use a film simulation, always color grade your footage a bit more. There's always something that you can pull out. Even in classic chrome, I usually add a bit more contrast and saturation and so on to really make the colors pop a bit more. So that is how you can color grade F-Log using LUTs, but you can also do that completely by yourself. And this is what we will do in the next shot here. As you can see, that's straight out of camera in F-Log, so very flat and not good looking. So the first step that I do here is always I turn my scopes on here. As you can see here, there's a normal waveform monitor for the luminance levels. Then here I can see where all my colors are in the vector tool, and here in the RGB parade I can also see where my colors are, but it shows it a bit differently. So the first step that I want to do here is I want to adjust the exposure of the shot. So basically what I did here using the color wheels in native Final Cut, I brought down the shadows a bit so that it's just close to the 0 point here in the luma curve, because you don't want to go below 0. Then it means that it clips your shadows and that's totally dark, so you lose detail there. So always stay above 0. And here you also want to stay below 100, because otherwise you would clip your highlights. So that's why this tool is actually very important. It's the most important tool ever for me. And I also did some adjustments to the midtones, because after adjusting the shadows, so now you could see when I pull the midtones down again, it looked a bit dark, so I brought the midtones up to show all the details here in the motorbikes, etc. And then what I also saw is that it had a bit of a tint in the shadow. So when I undo that here, you can see that the shadows have a bit of a yellow tint here, and you can actually see that here in the waveform monitor, that here a bit of blue is missing. The blue is lower than the other parts. So what I simply did here, I compensated for that by introducing a bit more blue into the shadows, and there you can see it looks a lot better here in the graph, but also here the shadows come out a bit more bluish, so that looks better. So that were the first adjustments that I did here to bring F-Log to a usable format. And after that I also gave it more contrast by using color curves, again with an S-curve here, so you can directly see looks so much better. Like, yeah, it gets a bit dark in the midtones, but for that shot I actually like that, because the sun is behind the subject, so that works for this shot. And yeah, like, you can generally remember that when you want to add contrast with curves, just give it an S form and then you have more contrast. Definitely adjust it per shot, because on different shots you want to have a different S curve so that it really looks good. And that's basically bringing it from F-Log to a usable level. Like you can see here, that's a totally usable shot, but the colors are pretty normal, and you know me, I just love to go a bit crazy with the colors. So that's why I applied hue versus saturation curves here to go to a final look. And the first thing I did here was to change the hue via the hue versus hue curve of that clip, because the sun here is a bit too yellow. I just don't like when it's too yellow. So I raised this curve here a little bit so that it goes more into the orange direction. As you can see here, that directly looks better. So even without the saturation, it looks a bit better. And then I added saturation here via making these points in the hue versus saturation curve, but only for the orange parts and the red parts of the image, to really make the sun pop more and make this image appear nice and warm. While I added some other points to keep the green and blue areas low in saturation. So you can see that here in the shadows, the blue is actually not too pronounced, it's not too saturated, and that's why it looks good. Then I also used another trick here. You see here there's this luma versus saturation curves, and that's a little color grading trick. So when I undo that, you can see here that there's still a bit of a tint in the image, and you can see that here in the motorbike, here in that area, there is a lot of like red artifacting going on in the motorbike. So I don't want to have that, and by simply doing that, by lowering the saturation in the shadows, I can easily get rid of this red stuff going on there in the motorbike, and that makes the clip look pretty clean. And this stuff in the shadows actually happens quite a lot in footage of every camera, not just Fuji. So knowing this trick definitely can rescue sometimes. So that's how I would do it if I would completely custom color grade it. But there's also another solution. Let's say you bring it to a usable level like we did in the first step here, but then you don't want to mess around with this hue versus saturation curves all the time. Then you can also use a LUT. For example, here, if I apply a LUT from my Tange LUT pack, you will also find that on my website, then we directly get this pretty nice desaturated look. It's also a look that I like, but here, because of the sun, I definitely want to have more saturation. So here, after applying the LUT, I would just introduce a bit more saturation. And as you can see, it also looks pretty good. So that's how I custom color grade F-Log footage. I know it's still a bit complicated because there are so many tools available and you have to learn how to use them. And that's definitely a good reason to subscribe to this channel, because here I publish tutorials and tips videos every week, so that you can learn a lot. So definitely smash the subscribe and the bell notifications button right now. But also, to be totally honest, I love to save time in post-production. That's why 99% of my clips are color color graded with LUTs, either my own creative LUTs, but also oftentimes the Fujifilm and film simulation LUTs that I showed you here. So all great LUTs, and they save you so much time that I would actually say the best thing to do is really to use this LUTs instead of custom color grade F-Log. So I hope you enjoyed this video and it was helpful. If yes, then also leave me a thumbs up, and I hope to see you in the next video.